Welcome back to the deep dive. You know, you're here because you don't want to waste time sorting through all the clutter. You want to get to the heart of things. And we're all about that here. So let's get straight to it. Today, we're going to be diving into a really interesting area, I think, the world of research antibodies and reagents.
Yeah, these are really essential tools in research, and they're used in pretty much every field of biological research and drug development that you can think of.
And the cool thing is, we got our hands on a pretty in-depth report about this global market. And it really helped me see where things stand right now and where they might be heading in the future.
It's a rapidly evolving market, that's for sure.
So I think the first thing we should talk about is the big picture, right? What's the headline finding from this report? What's the main takeaway?
Well, the headline is growth, big time growth. The global market for research antibodies and reagents, it's already pretty substantial, but it's projected to reach USD 924.6 million in 2025.
Okay, that's a pretty huge number right there.
It is. And then get this, by 2033, it's expected to hit USD 2111.77 million. That's a compound annual growth rate, your CAGR of 7.00%.
Wow, a 7% growth rate year after year? That's significant. What's fueling that kind of increase?
A lot of it comes down to, well, I think it's fairly clear, the increasing prevalence of chronic diseases and cancer globally.
Yeah, it makes sense. The more research we do in those areas, the more demand there's going to be for these tools. So this report's making some pretty big projections there, but it's important to understand where those numbers are coming from. I mean, what's the timeline they use to come up with this forecast?
Right. You've got to have a solid foundation. And they do. They've used 2024 as their base year for all this analysis. So they looked back at the historical period from 2021 to 2024 to identify the trends.
And from there?
From there, they used 2025 as their estimated year, which is the starting point for the full forecast period that goes all the way to 2033.
Okay, so we've got a clear picture of the timeline. Now let's talk about geography, because I know this market isn't evenly distributed around the world. Where's most of the action happening right now, and where is it expected to shift in the coming years?
Right now, North America is the king of the hill, no question. They hold over 40% of the global market share.
Wow, over 40%. That's a lot.
It is, and they're projected to have a market size of USD 5,009.84 million in 2025. But what's really interesting, I think this is a key insight from the report, is the projected growth in the Asia-Pacific region.
Right, I saw that too. That region's really on the rise.
Exactly. They're currently at around 23% of the market share, but they're predicted to have the highest growth rate of any region, a whopping 9.0% CGR.
That's a huge difference.
It is. So while North America is still dominant, you can see a potential power shift happening as Asia-Pacific gains more momentum. And I think this really matters for everyone in this field, researchers, companies, investors, policymakers, everyone.
Absolutely. It sounds like anyone involved in this market needs to be paying very close attention to what's happening in Asia Pacific. So let's break this down region by region, starting with the current leader, North America. What's specifically driving their market, and what kind of growth are they expecting?
So we've already talked about that huge market size of USD 5,009.84 million in 2025, and they're still projected to grow at a solid rate, 5.2% CAGR, from 2025 to 2033.
So they're not just sitting still.
No, not at all. If we zoom in closer, the United States really takes the lead within North America. They're looking at a market size of USD 952.76 million and a 5.0% CAGR.
Yeah, they've always been a powerhouse when it comes to research.
That's right. And then you have Canada holding a significant share at USD 601.18 million with a slightly higher growth rate of 6.0%. And rounding it out, Mexico is at USD 455.90 million with a 5.7% CGR.
So all of North America is experiencing solid growth.
Exactly. And the report points to a few key factors fueling this growth. A lot of investment in life sciences research, both public and private, a high prevalence of chronic diseases, which is a huge driver of research and drug development, and this increasing push towards personalized medicine.
Okay, so a combination of robust research infrastructure, healthcare needs, and cutting-edge medical approaches all coming together.
Yeah, I think that sums it up pretty well.
Now, what about Europe? How do they stack up in comparison to North America?
So Europe is the second largest market globally, with a projected size of USD 357.38 million in 2025. And they're expecting a healthy CAGR of 5.5%.
Okay, so still a major player in the market, but not quite at North America's level.
Right. If we look at specific countries, the United Kingdom is a standout performer with a projected market size of USD 631.24 million and a strong growth rate of 6.3%.
That's impressive.
It is. And then you have Germany, another big contributor at USD 743.96 million with a 5.7% CAGR.
Okay.
And then Russia, while significant in size at USD 582.39 million, has a slightly slower projected growth of 4.5%.
So even within Europe, there's some variation in growth rates.
Absolutely. But overall, the factors driving growth across Europe are pretty consistent. Increased research funding across different countries, that's always key.
Hmm.
And then there's a big focus on tackling both chronic and infectious diseases. And Europe's made some really impressive advancements in fields like proteomics, which, remember, is the large-scale study of proteins and genomics.
Right. And those are really driving personalized medicine and targeted therapies.
Exactly. So they have strong foundational research happening there and a real push for innovative healthcare.
And that's keeping them on a pretty solid growth trajectory.
That's right.
Okay, so we've got North America holding strong and Europe showing steady growth. But, we can't ignore the elephant in the room here, Asia Pacific.
Yeah.
What's driving that incredible growth rate we talked about earlier?
Yeah, Asia Pacific is the one to watch. Their estimated market size in 2025 is USD 2880.66 million. But as we mentioned earlier, that 9.0% CAGR is the real attention grabber here.
Right, it's a dramatic difference compared to the other regions.
It is. And within this region, China really stands out as a powerhouse. They're projected to have a market size of USD 109.88 million and an 8.5% CAGR.
Wow. I guess that's not really surprising, though, given their huge population and growing economy.
Exactly. They have the numbers and the resources to really make a significant impact.
Mm.
And India is no slouch either. They have a projected market size of USD 345.68 million and a CGR of 10.8%, even higher than China's.
So they're really catching up fast.
They are. And the report highlights a few key drivers for this growth. First off, they have a rapidly growing incidence of chronic diseases, which really creates an urgent need for new diagnostic tools and treatments.
Right. I imagine that creates huge demand for research.
It does. Then there's the fact that governments in the region are really stepping up their investments in scientific research and development. They're seeing it as a key driver for economic growth and global competitiveness.
That's a smart move.
And then there's the quick adoption of advanced diagnostic technologies. They're not afraid to embrace new technologies,
Right.
and that really helps fuel this growth.
Makes sense.
Plus, and this is really important, I think, the expansion of their own biotech and pharmaceutical sectors is a major factor here. They're not just consumers of research anymore, they're becoming major producers as well.
Right. That's a big shift.
It is. So this explosive growth in Asia Pacific, it's not just about market share or profits. It really points to a fundamental change in the global landscape of scientific research and innovation.
Absolutely. It's a trend that everyone needs to be aware of. Okay, so we've got North America, Europe, and Asia Pacific covered.
Yeah.
What about the other regions, Latin America and the Middle East and Africa? How are they playing into this global picture?
Okay, so Latin America, they have a market size of USD 626.23 million in 2025, and their projected CAGR is 6.4%.
Call it growth there.
Yeah. The key players in this region, you've got Brazil. They have a market size of USD 268.03 million and a 7.0% CAGR. And Argentina, they're at USD 105.21 million with a 7.3% CAGR.
And what's fueling their growth?
It's a mix of factors that we've already talked about. More funding for research, a growing prevalence of chronic diseases, unfortunately, that's a global trend, and an increasing interest in personalized medicine.
So they're kind of following similar trends as other regions.
Pretty much, yeah.
Okay. And finally, what about the Middle East and Africa? What's the outlook there?
So they're starting from a smaller base, USD 250.49 million in 2025, but they're showing a decent growth rate, projected at 6.7% CAGR. Within this region, the GCC countries, there's significant presence with a market size of USD 107.21 million and a 7.5% CAGR. And South Africa is doing well too at USD 39.58 million with a 7.7% CAGR.
So good potential for growth in that region.
Yes. The report highlights a few key drivers there, like increasing investments in biomedical research infrastructure. They're building up their research capacity. There's also a rising prevalence of various diseases, which drives the need for research, and a growing number of research collaborations.
Right. International collaborations are really important for sharing knowledge and resources.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got a good handle on the global map, but now let's get into the details. Let's zoom in and talk about what's actually being sold here, starting with reagents. What are the different types of reagents, and which one is the real workhorse of this market?
So, in the reagents world, the real star of the show, and you can't really have a show without it, is enzymes.
Enzymes. Why are they so important?
Well, they're basically the little molecular machines that make so many biological processes happen. I mean, think about it. PCR, that technique used to amplify DNA, gene editing technologies, and pretty much all protein analysis relies on enzymes.
Right, they're essential for a huge range of techniques.
Exactly. And they're incredibly versatile and specific. They can target really specific molecules and do their job with amazing precision, which is why they're so essential in any lab.
So enzymes are kind of like the foundation of a lot of research.
Yeah, I'd say so.
What about the rising stars in the reagents market? Which ones are seeing the most rapid growth?
Oh, that would definitely be probes.
Probes, tell me more about them.
So probes are really cool. They're like little molecular detectives. They're designed to detect and visualize specific biomolecules.
Okay.
So whether you're looking at cells, tissues, or anything else, probes help you find and see the molecules you're interested in. And the technology behind probes, especially fluorescence-based probes and molecular labeling, has really taken off in recent years.
Oh, I can imagine that's opening up a lot of new possibilities.
It really is. So now you see probes being used more and more in diagnostics, drug discovery, and even basic research things like cellular biology. And all that increased use is driving that rapid growth we see in the market.
Makes sense. Okay, so we've covered the reagent side of things, but there's another big player in this market, antibodies.
hmm
What can you tell us about the different types of antibodies and which one is currently the most widely used?
All right. So when it comes to antibodies, the ones that are used the most are the primary antibodies.
Primary antibodies, why are they so popular?
Well, think of it this way. They're the first line of attack. They directly bind to the specific antigen you're interested in.
Antigen being.
Oh, right.
Hmm,
So an antigen is basically any substance that triggers your immune system to produce antibodies.
got it.
So whether you're doing immunohistochemistry, that's where you're visualizing proteins in tissue samples, or Western blotting, which is used to detect specific proteins, or ELISA, the common lab test primary antibodies are the key to making those techniques work.
Okay, so they're essential for a lot of different research applications.
They are. They're like the foundation.
Yeah.
And the reason they're so widely used is because they're really reliable and they can target a huge variety of different proteins.
So it's all about precision and versatility.
Exactly.
Now, what about growth? Which type of antibody is seeing the most rapid expansion in the market?
The fastest growing area in the antibody world is the secondary antibody market.
Secondary antibodies. So how are they different from primary antibodies?
So, unlike primary antibodies, secondary antibodies don't directly bind to your target antigen. Instead, they bind to the primary antibodies.
Okay, so it's like a two-step process.
Exactly.
What's the point of that?
Well, it's all about boosting the signal. They amplify the signal in immunoassays like ELISA and Western blotting. And that's super helpful, especially when you're dealing with really small amounts of your target molecule.
So they're like signal boosters.
Yeah, you can think of them that way. They make it easier to detect and study those tiny amounts, and that's why they're in such high demand.
Makes sense. Now let's move on to the different forms that antibodies come in. What's the dominant form in the market right now?
The big one is monoclonal antibodies.
Monoclonal antibodies, why are they so widely used?
Well, they're pretty special because they're produced by a single clone of immune cells. So basically, it's like having an army of identical antibody factories.
Ah, so that means they're all producing the exact same antibody.
Exactly. And that gives them this incredibly high specificity for their target. They only bind to one very specific part of the antigen, and they do it really consistently.
So that's why they're so reliable.
Exactly. They're essential for things like diagnostics, like those at-home pregnancy tests, and in drug development, especially for targeted therapies.
Right, so this is where that personalized medicine aspect comes in.
Absolutely. They're also really important for identifying biomarkers, those molecules that can tell us a lot about disease processes.
Okay, so monoclonal antibodies are clearly playing a huge role. Now, which form of antibodies is experiencing the fastest growth?
That would be recombinant antibodies.
Recombinant antibodies, what makes them different?
So these are made using genetic engineering, not the traditional methods. And that gives them some significant advantages. For one, they tend to have even better specificity and reproducibility than monoclonal antibodies.
Even better.
Yep, and it's also about ethics. Recombinant antibodies can be produced without using animals, which is a big plus for many researchers and companies.
Right, the ethical aspect is becoming increasingly important.
It is. And this combination of precision, reproducibility, and ethical production, it's making recombinant antibodies really popular in drug discovery, diagnostics, and proteomics research.
So are they going to replace monoclonal antibodies?
It's hard to say for sure. It's not just about replacing, it's about having more options and better tools. Recombinant antibodies are definitely shaking things up and could really change the landscape in the coming years.
It's fascinating to see how technology is pushing this field forward. Now let's talk about how these antibodies and reagents are actually being used. What technologies do they use? What's the most widely used technology in this space right now?
Right now, the most common technology is Western blotting.
Western blotting. Remind me what that is.
Okay, so Western blotting, it's a technique that's been around for a while, but it's still going strong. It's used to analyze and detect specific proteins in a sample,
Uh-huh.
and it's really reliable, relatively simple to do, and really importantly, it relies on antibodies for that specificity, so you can target and visualize the exact protein you're interested in.
Okay, so it's a classic technique that's still widely used. What about the up-and-coming technologies? What's experiencing the fastest growth in this area?
The one to watch in terms of growth is flow cytometry.
Flow cytometry. Tell me about that.
So flow cytometry is really cool. It allows researchers to analyze tons of individual cells really quickly and look at multiple characteristics at the same time.
So it's like getting a detailed snapshot of what's happening in a population of cells.
Exactly. And it's super precise. You can look at things like the size of the cells, the shape, what kinds of molecules are on their surface, and even what's happening inside them.
Wow, that sounds really powerful.
It is. And that's why it's becoming more and more important in fields like immunology, cancer research, drug development, all areas where understanding individual cells is really critical.
So flow cytometry is clearly a technology that's gaining a lot of traction. Now let's consider the specific applications for all these antibodies and reagents. Where are they seeing the most demand?
Well, right now, the biggest demand is coming from drug development.
Drug development, that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, think about it. If you're trying to develop a new drug, you need tools to identify potential drug targets, track how diseases are progressing, and how patients are responding to treatment.
Uh-huh.
And that's where antibodies and reagents come in. They're used to validate those drug targets and test the efficacy and safety of those new drugs.
Right, so they're essential at pretty much every stage of the drug development process.
Exactly. And with the increasing focus on personalized medicine developing drugs tailored to individuals, that demand is only going to increase.
Okay, so drug development is clearly a major driver. What about emerging applications? What's the fastest growing application area in this market?
The fastest growing area is definitely proteomics.
Proteomics, right. That's the study of proteins.
Exactly. And remember, proteins are the real workhorses of the cell. They're involved in pretty much everything. So the better we understand proteins, the better we're going to understand diseases, how to diagnose them, and how to treat them. And with proteomics, we're able to look at the entire set of proteins in a cell or tissue sample. It's not just one protein at a time anymore. And this provides a much more complete picture.
So it's a much more powerful approach.
It is. And as this field continues to grow, and it's growing fast, the demand for antibodies and reagents is skyrocketing.
Okay, and what are some of the specific applications within proteomics that are driving this demand?
Well, for one, researchers are using proteomics to discover new biomarkers for different diseases. That could be for early diagnosis or for predicting how well someone might respond to a particular treatment.
I imagine that has huge implications for personalized medicine.
Absolutely. And it's not just about disease. They're also using proteomics to better understand basic biological processes, how cells function, how they communicate with each other, really fundamental stuff.
So it's driving both basic research and applied research.
Exactly. It's a really exciting field, and it's really pushing the boundaries of what we can do with antibodies and reagents.
That's really cool. Now, I'm curious, who are the main customers in this market? Who's buying all these antibodies and reagents?
Well, the biggest customers right now are the pharmaceutical and biotechnologies companies. They make up the largest share of the demand.
That makes sense. They're the ones developing all these new drugs and therapies.
Right. And they rely heavily on antibodies and reagents throughout the entire process, from initial discovery to testing and clinical trials. And with the rise of personalized medicine, their need for these tools is just going to keep growing.
Okay. But we've also talked about the growing importance of contract research organizations, the CROs. How are they impacting this market?
CROs are really becoming key players in this market, and they're the fastest growing end user group. They're basically the research partners for a lot of pharmaceutical and biotech companies, providing specialized services like drug discovery, biomarker identification, and those complex proteomic studies we were talking about.
So are they kind of like the behind-the-scenes heroes?
Yeah, you could say that. And they're in such high demand because they have the expertise and the capacity to handle these really complex and demanding research projects.
And it sounds like as research gets more complex, that demand for CROs is just going to keep increasing.
That's right.
Okay, so we've taken a pretty deep dive into the different segments of this market. But before we wrap up, I think it's important to step back and talk about the big picture again. What are the major forces that are driving the overall growth of the research antibodies and reagents market?
Well, there are a few key drivers. Firstly, there's been a huge increase in global investment in life sciences, research, and biotechnology. More funding means more research projects, and more research projects mean more demand for antibodies and reagents.
It's a pretty straightforward equation.
It is. And then there's the constant progress in technology, especially in antibody production. We're seeing more and more specific and targeted antibodies being developed, which makes them more useful for a wider range of applications.
So the technology is really enabling the growth of this market.
Absolutely. And lastly, and this is really important, there's the expanding use of these tools in personalized medicine and drug discovery. Those fields are really taking off, and they rely heavily on antibodies and reagents.
Okay, so we've got funding, technology, and applications all driving the market forward.
Exactly.
Now, what about challenges? What are some of the factors that might hold this market back?
Well, one of the big ones is cost. Developing and producing high quality antibodies, it's not cheap.
Right.
And that can be a real barrier for smaller research institutions or startups that don't have huge budgets. And another challenge is making sure that the antibodies are consistently high quality. You don't want to be doing an experiment and find out later that your antibody wasn't working properly.
Right. Reliability is crucial in research.
It is, and so a lot of work is being done to standardize the production process and make sure that antibodies are properly validated before they're used in research.
So these are real challenges, but it sounds like the industry is actively working to overcome them.
They are. It's a big priority because it really affects everyone involved.
Makes sense. Okay, before we wrap up, are there any other big trends we should be aware of, things that might shape the future of this market?
Yeah, definitely. One big trend is the move towards recombinant antibodies. We talked about them earlier. They're made using genetic engineering and offer a lot of advantages over traditional methods.
Right, the precision, the reproducibility, and the ethical aspects.
Exactly. And as that technology gets better and cheaper, we're likely to see recombinant antibodies becoming even more popular.
Okay, and what's the other trend?
The other one is a really strong focus on validation, making sure that the antibodies are doing what they're supposed to do.
Right, and that gets back to the reliability issue we talked about.
Exactly. There's a big push to develop and implement strict standards for antibody validation, and this is being driven by both the industry and research institutions.
So a real move towards ensuring the quality and reliability of these tools.
Exactly. It's absolutely crucial for the integrity of research.
Absolutely. Okay, and lastly, what about the competitive landscape? Who are the big players in this market, and what are they doing to stay ahead of the curve?
Well, it's a really competitive market with a bunch of established players who are always trying to innovate.
Makes sense. It's a big market, and everyone wants a piece of the pie.
That's right. They're always expanding their product portfolios, trying to offer the widest range of antibodies and reagents. And they're also really active in forming partnerships with other companies and institutions.
Partnerships, why are those so important?
Well, it allows them to access new technologies, expand into new markets, and share expertise.
Okay, so it's all about staying ahead of the game.
It is. And a good example of this is a partnership that happened recently in June 2023. Cell signaling technology, they're a really well-known antibody provider, and they teamed up with Lunaphore.
Lunaphore, I've heard of them.
Yeah, they specialize in automated spatial biology platforms. It's all about analyzing cells and tissues in their natural 3D environment. And the goal of the partnership was to deploy CST's antibodies on Lunaphore's Comet platform.
So it's about combining expertise to create something new.
Exactly. And that's what a lot of these companies are doing, looking for ways to innovate and create even more powerful tools for researchers.
So it sounds like a really dynamic and exciting field. So as we wrap up our deep dive here, what's the one big takeaway for our listeners?
I think the big takeaway is that The research antibodies and reagents market, it's big, and it's only going to get bigger. It's being fueled by this huge increase in global research activity, and the unfortunate truth is that chronic diseases and cancer, they're on the rise, and that's driving a lot of this research.
Mhm.
North America's the leader right now, but Asia Pacific is catching up
Like,
fast.
we can't ignore that.
We can't. And when we zoom in on those different segments of the market, those enzymes and probes, the primary and secondary antibodies, the different forms of antibodies, the technologies, the applications, it's all really fascinating and points to this incredibly dynamic and innovative field that's constantly evolving.
It's been a really fascinating discussion, and it really highlights how important this market is for scientific progress and ultimately for improving human health.
Absolutely.
So before we sign off, here's something to think about. Given all these rapid advances we're seeing, especially in recombinant antibody technology and personalized medicine, how do you think the power dynamics in this market might shift over the next decade? And what crazy new applications do you think we might see? The future is definitely going to be really interesting, so stay tuned and we'll keep you updated. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.